I am Immani, and I am 32 years old, and I have always been the disappointment in my family, and it became painfully obvious again when I arrived at my younger sister's wedding alone and dressed in a vintage gown I had spent over 100 painstaking hours restoring, and as I stepped out of the rideshare and looked up at the Atlanta mansion where the ceremony was taking place, I could already feel the judgment burning into my skin from every angle, because this place was meant to show off wealth and status and power, the kind my parents had spent their entire lives chasing and desperately trying to align with, and here I was walking in solo while my sister Danielle, the family's pride and joy, was having her dream wedding complete with a Vera Wang gown string quartet and a groom from a family that belonged on some old money registry, and I had not even reached the main lawn when the whispers began, and I heard the women from my father's circle pretending not to stare while their eyes sized me up from my hair down to my shoes, and it was Chad who saw me first, Danielle's new husband, with his pale hair and a smirk that never quite left his face, and when he whispered something in her ear, she turned to look at me, her smile stiffening before she passed off her champagne and headed toward me, her train dragging through the grass as she marched across the lawn, her face pulled tight in a smile that did not reach her eyes, and when she reached me, her voice was sharp and low like a blade hidden in a bouquet, and she said, "Immani, what are you doing here like this? You said you were bringing someone you promised," and I could feel the weight of that broken promise sink into my stomach, because 2 weeks earlier I had told them I was seeing someone serious, and when I had said that over the phone, my mother Brenda had burst into laughter, the kind that stung more than it should have, because she called him imaginary, and begged me to stop embarrassing myself with these sad stories, and I had insisted I was not lying. I said he was flying in from Shanghai, and the delay was unavoidable, and I had meant every word of it at the time, but saying it again now felt heavier and more desperate, and Danielle rolled her eyes and muttered, "Shanghai, you could not have just said traffic in Buckhead," and she glanced back at the crowd like I was a stain on her perfect picture, and then she looked at my dress with that same judgment, and waved her hand vaguely like what I was wearing offended her. It was vintage real silk from the 1930s, and to me it was art, but to her it was just old and unimpressive, and she told me to go stand in a corner and not speak to anyone, because she could not afford even a whisper of embarrassment. And before I could respond, our father Marcus was approaching fast with Brenda behind him, her nervous smile already set in place, and he did not wait for any explanation. He just boomed about flights from Shanghai like it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard, and told me if I had no one to bring I should not have come at all, because I was making them look stupid in front of Chad's parents, the Thorntons, who were busy charming everyone on the terrace, and Brenda reached out and tugged at my sleeve, her eyes flitting up and down the silk like she could not decide whether to scold me or fix me, and she asked if I made it myself with this frown that barely concealed her pity, and said I should at least try to look like a grown woman on my sister's big day, and I stood there letting the shame soak in, knowing that to them I was a failure because I was not a lawyer or a banker or anyone they could brag about. I was just someone who spent her life restoring forgotten fabrics and faded artwork, and I told them he was real, that his name was Zayn, and he was coming, and Marcus let out a laugh that could have shattered glass, and everyone turned to look, and he leaned in with this ugly smile, and told me I was pathetic, that I could not even get a man to be seen with me for one night, and he called me an embarrassment, and I could feel the heat in my face and the sting in my chest, but I forced myself to say that I had done nothing wrong by showing up, and that I deserved to be here, and that was when everything changed, because Marcus's face shifted, and all his fake charm evaporated, and pure rage took over, and he said I dared to talk back to him in front of these people, and he said I ruined everything, and then he raised his hand, and I thought he was going to hit me, but instead he shoved me hard, and I stumbled back, my heel catching on the edge of the fountain behind me. And then I was falling, and there was no time to catch myself before I hit the water, and it was freezing and heavy, and I went under before I could even take a breath, and when I came up gasping, I was dripping wet in the middle of the fountain, and everything was silent for a heartbeat. Before the laughter began, it was not concern or shock. It was actual amusement, like the guests thought this was some grand performance, and I saw the Thorntons barely hiding their laughter, and I saw my father lift his hands like he had performed a magic trick and say it looked like I needed to cool off, and the crowd applauded and cheered like he had just made a funny toast, and I could barely hear the music over the pounding in my ears, and I saw Danielle looking furious not for me but for herself because her perfect wedding was being upstaged by her pathetic sister, and Brenda was staring at the ground like I had done this to myself, and I remembered being 16 and winning an art award and Marcus tearing my charcoal drawing in half in front of my friends because I missed Danielle's cheer tryouts, and I stood in the fountain soaked and shivering and humiliated. But I was not going to cry, not yet. Instead, I looked right at him, at all of them, and I smiled a cold, sharp smile, and I said, "Remember this moment," and the words cut through the laughter and made the crowd quiet again, and I climbed out of the fount, in my ruined shoes slipping on the marble, and I walked soaking and silent, past the stunned guests, past the quartet, past the bar, and into the house, and I found the bridal suite, and locked the door, and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing not just from the cold or the water, but from the years of silence and pain, and I cried for every time they had broken me, and I wiped my face and checked my phone hoping for a message, and there was none, and I whispered, "Please tell me you are coming," and I remembered our call 2 nights ago when Zayn asked if I wanted him to cancel everything and fly in, and I told him no. I said I wanted to go alone one last time because I wanted them to see me for who I was, not who I married, and I told him I wanted to face them by myself, and I had believed it then, but now I felt so small and so stupid, and I texted him again telling him everything, how Marcus pushed me, how the crowd laughed, how I was cold and shaking, and I begged him to come, and that was when the pounding came on the door, and it was Danielle screaming that I was ruining everything, that Chad's parents were asking questions, and I had come out and apologize, and I told her to go back to the party, and she lost it and threatened me, saying if I did not lie and say I slipped, she would tell everyone why I dropped out of college. And I froze because I remembered that night in my sophomore year when Danielle crashed her new car into a doctor's car, and the settlement fees were so high Marcus said they had to pull my tuition to pay them, and I never went back, and they let everyone believe I had just failed, and now she was threatening to use that secret to destroy me, and I sat there frozen and alone until my phone rang, and it was Zayn, and he said he was on the plane and already rerouted to Atlanta, and he asked what happened, and I told him, and he said he had already called his team and the lawyers, and they would be there in minutes, and I told him no, not yet. I did not want security, I did not want lawyers, I just wanted him. I said I needed to walk back out there on my own, and that when he arrived I would need him to do something only he could do, and then I stood up, wiped my face, wrapped a stolen shawl around my soaked dress, and prepared to walk back into the garden, not as a victim, but as a storm. I stepped back into the garden, still dripping water, with my hair damp against my neck, and the borrowed shawl wrapped tightly around my shoulders, and the moment my shoes touched the stone patio, the music stopped again, and every head turned toward me, and this time I did not lower my eyes or rush away, because something inside me had shifted, and the humiliation had burned down into a quiet, steady resolve, and I could feel it holding me upright as whispers rolled through the crowd like a low tide. And I saw my father Marcus stiffen when he noticed I had returned, and his face twisted with anger, as if my presence alone was an insult he had not planned for, and my mother Brenda was already moving toward me with panic written across her face, while Danielle stood frozen near Chad, her hands clenched so tightly into her bouquet that her knuckles had gone white, and before anyone could stop him, Marcus raised his voice again and demanded to know why I was still here, and said he thought I would have the decency to leave after making such a scene, and I looked at him calmly and told him I had just stepped inside to breathe, and that I would not miss his speech, and my words carried across the lawn clearly enough that people stopped whispering and stared, and I did not wait for his response because I had already decided what I needed to do next, and I turned and walked past the fountain that had swallowed me moments earlier, and past the tables filled with half-finished drinks and nervous smiles, and I headed straight toward the most important table in the garden, where Chad's parents sat watching everything unfold with thinly veiled disgust and curiosity. And when I stopped in front of them, Mrs. Thornton clutched her pearls, and Mr. Thornton straightened in his chair, clearly unsure how to react to the soaked woman standing before them, and I introduced myself as Danielle's older sister and apologized for the disruption with a calmness that surprised even me, and I said my father had a strange sense of humor and that sometimes family traditions went too far, and I could see the confusion flicker across their faces because this was not the breakdown they had expected, and across the lawn I saw Marcus freeze because he knew exactly what I was doing, and he did not like it at all, and he rushed toward the small stage and grabbed the microphone before anyone else could say a word, and he launched into a speech about family and pride and integrity, and he spoke loudly and confidently like the perfect patriarch reclaiming control, and he praised Danielle as the daughter who had chosen the right path, and he talked about discipline and success and hard work, and the guests applauded politely, even though their eyes kept drifting back to me. And then his tone changed, and he began talking about those who wandered, those who wasted their lives on hobbies, and expected others to clean up their messes, and the laughter that followed was uncomfortable and cruel, and I stood there feeling the weight of his words, but I did not move because I knew what was coming next even before the sound reached us, and at first it was only a low vibration beneath the music like distant thunder, and then it grew louder and stronger until the champagne glasses on the tables began to tremble, and guests looked around in confusion, and someone shouted asking if it was the police, and then a shadow swept across the lawn, and everyone looked up as a massive black helicopter emerged over the treetops, circling the estate slowly and deliberately like it owned the sky, and the wind from its blades sent petals and napkins flying, and the roar drowned out every voice including my father's, and the aircraft lowered itself toward the lawn and landed with impossible precision right in the middle of the wedding grounds, and silence fell so hard it felt physical, and the side door opened. Two men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the area with practiced efficiency, and then he appeared, and even before he reached the ground, I knew it was Zayn because the air changed around him, and he moved with a calm authority that did not need announcement, and some of the guests gasped because they recognized him, and I saw Mr. Thornton grab his wife's arm and whisper his name with disbelief and fear, because this was not a man who attended weddings or social gatherings, and Zayn did not look at anyone else as he walked across the lawn, and every step he took felt like it echoed through my chest. And he stopped in front of me, and for a moment the world shrank down to just us, and he touched my face, gently wiping away a streak of water and mascara, and apologized for being late, and I smiled and told him I knew he would come, and then he kissed me right there in front of everyone, and the sound of the collective gasp washed over us, and Marcus finally found his voice again, and shouted, demanding to know what was happening, and Zayn turned calmly, and said he was the imaginary boyfriend, and then corrected himself, and said he was my husband, and the words landed like an explosion, and my mother made a small broken sound, and my sister stared at us in horror and denial, and Mr. Thornton's expression shifted instantly from contempt to desperate respect as he rushed forward trying to introduce himself, and Zayn ignored his outstretched hand and pulled me closer and said clearly that he was not their family but mine, and that his wife had just been assaulted by her father, and the shock rippled through the remaining guests, and Mr. Thornton repeated the word assaulted in disbelief, and my father stammered that it was an accident and a joke gone wrong, and I leaned into Zayn feeling steady and protected, and I told him about the loan I had begged for years ago, and how my father had refused, and Zayn spoke about my work at the Louvre and the Met and the private collections that trusted only me, and I watched as the Thorntons recalculated everything they thought they knew, and the disgust on their faces shifted away from me and settled squarely on my family, and Danielle lost control and screamed that I was lying and accused me of being a college dropout expelled for cheating. And Zayn calmly corrected her and spoke about my degrees and offers and achievements, and Danielle panicked and pointed at our parents, demanding they confirm her story, and that was when I stepped forward and told the truth about what really happened, and how she had cheated, and how I had taken the blame at their request, and the silence that followed was thick and suffocating, and Mrs. Thornton turned to her husband and said she would not allow their family to be associated with lies and violence, and Chad finally asked Danielle if it was true, and she broke down confessing everything, and the Thorntons announced they were leaving and pulling all funding from my father's company, and the guests began scatter as my father collapsed into a chair, defeated and broken, and the wedding dissolved into chaos, and my mother rushed toward me begging me to fix it and to tell Zayn to call them and say it was a misunderstanding, and I told her it was assault and not a misunderstanding, and she dismissed it and casually mentioned the time he broke my arm when I was 12, and Zayn turned sharply and asked her to repeat what she had said, and the garden went quiet again as he confronted Marcus about breaking my arm. And my father tried to lie, but I spoke up and told the truth about the night I saw him stealing from the company safe and how he shoved me into the fireplace and lied about it. And Zayn signaled his security, and the projector was set up, and the old footage played showing everything, and the truth finally stood exposed in front of everyone, and my father's lies collapsed completely. And my sister ran screaming into the night, and my mother stood trembling, realizing the cost of her silence. And as the screen went dark again, I knew nothing would ever be the same, and that the moment they laughed at me in the fountain was the moment their power over me ended forever. The grainy footage on the large projection screen froze every conversation and every movement in that once cheerful garden, and the gasps that followed the image of my 12-year-old self being shoved violently by Marcus and crashing against the brick fireplace were not exaggerated or performative. They were real because no one in that crowd could pretend it was an accident, not when the body language, the rage, and the aftermath were so painfully clear. And when the footage cut to black, the stunned silence was so thick it felt like the air had been vacuumed out of the estate, and my mother, Brenda, stood motionless, her face pale, her mouth open in disbelief, and her hands shaking as she whispered to herself over and over again, "No, no, no," like she was trying to wake herself from a nightmare. And I turned and faced my parents fully now, my voice calm and steady, even though I could still feel tremble in my fingers, and I told them I had found that footage while working on a project to recover old company files, and I had not looked for it. I had only wanted to remember something good, anything that proved I was not imagining the man I had once called my father. And now I stood there watching him come undone in front of all the people he had spent a lifetime trying to impress, and it was Danielle who broke the silence first, and she screamed a strangled sound of disbelief and panic as she ran across the lawn, her once perfect wedding gown dragging behind her through grass and mud and tears streaking down her face, and she stopped in front of me, grabbing my arms with both hands, shaking them, and begging me to stop, saying I had won, and that I had destroyed everything. And she cried that the Thorntons would never forgive her, and that Chad had walked away, and her future was in ruins, and she pleaded with me to take down the video, to say it was not real, to fix what I had broken. And I looked at her, and I asked if she remembered the time she begged me to take the blame for her cheating scandal, the time I lost my scholarship, and was branded a failure because she could not afford to lose her law school acceptance, and she had no answer, just more tears and broken sobs. And I told her no, I would not take anything down, because for once the truth was more powerful than their lies. And she collapsed to the ground sobbing, while the remaining guests looked on, some still frozen in place, others quietly grabbing their things, desperate to flee the wreckage of what had become a social catastrophe. And then Brenda ran toward me, her face still white, but her eyes sharp with something new, not just desperation, but a glimmer of fear, and she grabbed my arm and begged me to tell Zayn to call Robert Thornton and fix it, and to say it was all a misunderstanding. And I told her again that it was not a misunderstanding, that Marcus had assaulted me in front of everyone, and had lied for decades, and she shook her head with impatience, and leaned in close, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. And she said not because of the push, because of the video, the timestamp on the footage that showed Marcus was in the office past midnight, the same night the money went missing. And I felt my breath catch in my throat as the implications unfolded in my mind. And she whispered that if I sent that footage to the police or to the Thorntons or anyone else, then Marcus would not just lose face, he would go to prison for embezzlement, because the video showed him in the office alone, right after he had taken the money, and it was proof. And she said that exposing this would destroy our family. completely, and she asked me if I really wanted revenge that badly, if I was willing to end my father's life, as he knew it, and I turned slowly to look at Marcus, and saw that he had overheard every word because his face had gone from pale to sickly green, and his eyes were wide with horror as the truth hit him that Brenda had just handed me the one weapon he feared more than anything else, and for the first time he looked not angry, not arrogant, but terrified, and Zayn stood beside me watching everything, his expression unreadable, but his presence like steel at my back, and he did not speak, he just waited, and when I turned back to Marcus, I said out loud that he had embezzled the money, and this time I was not asking, I was stating it as fact, and Marcus broke visibly, his whole frame sagging as the last of his pride drained from him, and he whispered that the economy had been bad and the company was failing, and he had only borrowed it, and he had paid it back, and no one had gotten hurt, and I repeated his words with icy calm, no one got hurt, and then I looked him in the eye, and said he had made sure of that by breaking my arm, and threatening a child into silence, and the crowd that remained, even the ones who had stayed just to watch the disaster unfold, stood stunned and motionless, and I knew I had a choice. A single word from me to Zayn and Marcus would be arrested by nightfall, and Brenda knew it and Danielle knew it, and even Marcus now knew it, and he looked at me with a plea in his eyes that made my skin crawl, and I took a long, slow breath, and said I would not release the video, and I would not call the police, and Brenda exhaled in relief, and Marcus looked like he might cry, and then I said but only on one condition, and he looked up and asked if I wanted money, and I told him no, I had my own money and my husband's, and I did not need a single cent from him. And then I said I wanted the company, I wanted Wilson and Sons Construction, I wanted full control, I wanted every share, every piece of ownership signed over to me, and I wanted Marcus out, retired permanently, and the silence that followed was sharp and hard, and Danielle, who had collapsed into silence, suddenly laughed bitterly and asked what I knew about construction, and I told her I knew about restoration, and that I would turn the company into Wilson Heritage Restoration, and use it to preserve history, not erase it. And Marcus exploded in fury, saying he would never hand over his legacy to me, that he had built it from the ground up, and I did not argue. I simply turned to Zayn and told him to call the lawyers and the police, and Marcus screamed for me to wait, and the sound of his voice cracked with fear, and he begged and pleaded and finally said yes, he would sign everything over, and that was how 2 days later, on a gray Monday morning, I walked into the boardroom at Wilson and Sons and took my place at the head of the table, and Marcus sat there looking like a shadow of himself, and Brenda beside him, and Danielle at the far end, and Zayn in the corner, silent and commanding, and our lawyer slid the papers across the table and said the terms were simple. Marcus would resign and for all shares to me, and in exchange I would sign an agreement never to release the footage or speak of the embezzlement, and Marcus stared at the pen like it was poison, and then he signed, and the company was mine, and when Danielle shrieked asking where her share was, I told her she had already received everything in her $1 million wedding, her convertible, her law school tuition, and every benefit paid for by my sacrifice, and that she had been compensated in full, and the meeting ended, and I walked into the CEO office for the first time since I was 12, and the space was dark and heavy and reeked of cigars and ego, and the walls were lined with photos of Marcus shaking hands with governors and Danielle smiling in her graduation gown, and I took each frame and removed the photos and let them fall to the floor, and I called my lead architect and said the renovation would start here, that we would gut the office and let the light in, and while the crew measured and prepped, Zayn called to ask how it went, and I told him it was done, that I was sitting in Marcus's chair, and he said I deserved it, and then with a smile in his voice he told me a little piece of news, that Chad's family business had been struggling, and had depended on that contract with my father, and when that was pulled they crumbled, and Zayn's firm had acquired all of Chad's debt, and now he had filed for bankruptcy, and I sat there smiling, not with malice, but with quiet satisfaction, because for once justice had come full circle, and the people who had laughed at me in the fountain now sat in the ruins of their own making, and I was not just black sheep anymore, I was the storm that cleared the rot from the family tree. The transformation of Wilson and Sons had only just begun, but already the building felt different, like the ghosts of all the years I had spent being overlooked, dismissed, and belittled were finally beginning to scatter, and the stale scent of cigar smoke and dark wood polish was replaced with the clean smell of fresh paint and plaster dust, and I stood in what used to be my father's fortress, now stripped of its dominance, now open to the air and light, and I stared at the wide windows where heavy curtains had been torn down, letting the morning sun blaze onto the white walls, and for a moment I let myself close my eyes and breathe deeply, not as the girl who once cowered in the hallway of this office, but as the woman who now owned every inch of it, and my design team moved like shadows behind me, taking measurements, marking off corners, discussing restoration plans in soft, clipped voices, and I was reviewing a set of blueprints when the foreman walked in and said I had a visitor, and I turned expecting one of the new contractors or maybe a supplier, but it was my mother Brenda standing hesitantly at the threshold, and for a second I almost did not recognize her, the woman who had once been flawless and polished down to her manicured fingertips was now faded, her roots showing, her face bare of makeup, and her posture uncertain, like she no longer knew who she was without the mask she had worn for decades. And she looked around the office, taking in the transformation, and murmured that it looked different, and I replied simply that it was a renovation and that we were letting in the light, and she walked slowly into the room, trailing her fingers along the edge of a cabinet coated with plaster dust, and she told me Marcus had not left the bedroom in over a week, and that he just sat staring at the wall like someone had unplugged the last light in him, and I nodded, not out of sympathy but acknowledgement, and said I was sorry to hear that, and Brenda shook her head and said, "No, do not be sorry, because you were right, and we were wrong," and I finally looked up from the blueprints and saw her eyes red-rimmed and filled with something I had not seen in a long time, humility, and she said she had been scared of Marcus, scared of losing everything, the house, the club, the reputation, and that she had let that fear silence her and blind her and let her sacrifice her own daughter over and over just to keep her place in the illusion of perfection, and she asked how she could ever make it up to me, how she could possibly earn forgiveness, and I stood in silence for a moment, then said I did not know if she could, that maybe it was too late for some things, but that I could offer her one chance, and I walked over to the desk and shuffled through the stack of files and offered her a job, not as a manager or a figurehead, but as an intern in the accounting department, and I told her it would be $15 an hour and that she would report to the new chief financial officer and would learn the system from the ground up, and her face flickered with shock and confusion, and she asked if I was serious, and I said yes, because it was more than they had ever offered me, and if she wanted to understand what it meant to rebuild from nothing, she could start the same way I had, with dirt under her nails and spreadsheets in her hands, and she did not cry or argue. She just nodded slowly and whispered thank you, and I could see her mind reeling at the weight of what that meant, and what she had lost, and what little she might still be able to recover. And a week later I met Danielle at a coffee shop that could not have been more average, the kind of strip mall chain cafe that she once would have refused to enter, and she arrived 10 minutes late, looking like a shadow of herself, her blonde highlights grown out, her designer clothes replaced with an old sweater and dark circles under her eyes, and she slid into the booth across from me and folded her hands together and said that Chad was gone, that the divorce was finalized, and his family had annulled the marriage, claiming fraud and scandal, and that she was working now at a small law firm in the suburbs doing basic divorce paperwork, and she said she was not on track for partnership and barely scraping by. And she said it all with a flat voice, no performance, no drama, just a quiet resignation that the world she built was gone, and she asked if I hated her, and I looked at her and said I did not hate her, I pitied her because she had spent so long chasing a version of success built on lies and stolen opportunities, and I told her that I hoped she would find her way out of that darkness and learn how to be real, and she said nothing more, just sat there in silence, and for once she did not argue or deflect, and then she stood and walked away, and I sat there alone, sipping cold coffee and letting the past loosen its grip on my throat, and the next day I returned to the office where the renovation had reached the final stages, and the crew was preparing to install the last pieces of tempered glass and natural wood trim that would turn the space from a monument to ego into a workspace of vision and history, and I was standing near the new blueprint wall going over the launch timeline for our first project when Zayn walked in unannounced and smiling, and the sight of him standing there in his crisp suit, his eyes only on me, made the chaos of the past weeks melt away, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled me into an embrace that silenced everything, and he whispered that he had booked us a week at the Villa in Co. because I needed air and rest and beauty, and I laughed into his chest and said I would go only if we flew commercial, and he said no, that was non-negotiable, and I rolled my eyes but nodded, and later that evening we sat in my new office, the glass doors open to the breeze and the scent of sawdust still lingering in the air, and I told him that this company would never again be a monument to abuse or corruption, and that we would turn it into something real, into a legacy that healed not harmed, and Zayn raised his glass of mineral water and toasted not to revenge but to restoration, and I clinked mine against his and felt the weight of his words settle inside me like a vow. And that night I stood in the parking lot looking up at the new sign being hoisted onto the building, the letters gleaming in soft white light, Wilson Heritage Restoration. And for the first time since I was a child, I felt like I had found my place not in their world, but in mine and the foundation beneath. My feet was no longer crumbling, it was solid, it was mine, it was earned. The opening day of Wilson Heritage Restoration felt nothing like the old world my father had built and ruled from, because the halls that once echoed with his booming commands were now filled with the steady rhythm of construction, crews, the soft shuffle of designers and architects, the low hum of fresh energy and honest purpose, and the team I had carefully assembled over those past few weeks moved with intent and belief, not out of fear or legacy, but because they saw a vision worth building. And as I walked through the newly finished lobby with its polished concrete floors, reclaimed timber beams and gallery walls filled with historic textile restorations I had worked on by hand, I could feel something in my chest that I had never known before in this building, pride not the kind that demands recognition or applause, but the kind that sits quietly inside and reminds you that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. And that morning, I was scheduled to lead the introductory seminar for the new hires and interns, many of whom had come from art programs and preservation schools that I once dreamed of attending before my life had been rerouted by someone else's choices, and I stepped into the glass-walled conference room wearing a fitted charcoal suit and the same antique brooch I used to keep hidden in my studio coat, because now I wore my history openly, and the room quieted the moment I entered, not out of fear but respect, and I began by telling them the story of a dress from the 19th century that had been mistakenly stored in a damp cellar, and how I spent over 120 hours slowly removing mold from each thread, because when something matters you give it time and patience and care. And I told them that this company would treat people the same way as artifacts, with reverence, with purpose, with a belief in second chances, and they nodded and took notes. And when I finished speaking, there was a pause and then quiet applause, and I felt the tears prick behind my eyes, but I blinked them away because this was not a moment for grief, it was beginning. And after the meeting, I stepped into my office, which was flooded with natural light from the new skylight installed directly above the desk, and the first thing I saw was a cream envelope with no name left carefully in the center of the polished glass, and I opened it slowly and unfolded the handwritten letter inside, and the handwriting was shaky but familiar, and it was from Brenda, and she wrote that she had completed her first week as an intern in the accounting department, and had learned more about responsibility in those 5 days than she had in 5 decades, and she thanked me for the opportunity, and said that she hoped to earn not forgiveness but usefulness, and that she would no longer ask for grace, only the chance to work for it. And I folded the letter gently and placed it in the drawer, not to forget it, but to preserve it, and then I turned to my monitor, where our first restoration proposal had just been approved by the Atlanta Historical Society, and we had been awarded the contract to restore the century-old Peach Street Opera House, a building long forgotten but rich with detail. And when I read the project brief, I smiled, because the kind of work I had once done Alone in quiet museums would now be seen and celebrated and protected, and I knew exactly which team members I wanted to lead each phase, and I began assigning roles not with cold precision, but with care matching their strengths to each detail, because people flourished when you trusted them, and as I finalized the assignments my phone buzzed, and it was a message from Zayn that simply said rooftop 10 minutes, and I closed my laptop and took the private elevator to the top floor where we had designed a rooftop garden not for clients, but for ourselves, a quiet space with soft lighting, native plants, and reclaimed benches. And when I stepped out, he was already there holding 2 coffees and wearing that calm, steady smile that could make any storm in my mind still, and I took the cup and sat beside him, our shoulders brushing, and for a moment we said nothing, just watched the city stretch out beneath us, alive and indifferent and beautiful. And then he said he had something for me and reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box, not velvet or ornate, just simple and elegant. And when I opened it, I found a ring made of brushed silver with a tiny antique sapphire set in the center, and he said it was not a replacement for our wedding rings, but a symbol for today, the day we began building not just a life, but a legacy. And I stared at it and then at him, and felt something open in me like a window long sealed shut, and I slid the ring onto my right hand and said I would wear it in every meeting and every restoration as a reminder of who I was and who we were. And that evening, as the staff slowly left and the building quieted, I walked the empty halls alone, touching the cool walls, the newly painted frames, the glass doors, and I thought of how many times I had once been told I was wandering, aimless, unworthy, and yet here I was with keys to a kingdom I had built from the ashes they left behind. And when I reached the front entrance, I looked out at the parking lot and saw a familiar figure standing beside a modest used sedan, and it was Danielle. And for a second I considered walking back inside, but something made me step out and approach her, and she turned when she heard my footsteps, her eyes wary, her mouth tense, and I asked what she was doing here, and she said she had come to say goodbye, that she had taken a job out of state and would be leaving tomorrow, and that she did not expect anything from me, not forgiveness, not understanding, but she wanted me to know that she had finally started telling the truth, not just to others, but to herself. And she said she had begun attending therapy and had told her new firm everything about her past, and that if they fired her, so be it. And I watched her speak and saw not the girl who had once lied and manipulated, but a woman learning how to carry her own weight. And when she finished, she turned to leave, and I called her name, and she paused, and I said quietly that healing was not a performance, it was a process, and if she truly meant to start that process, then I wished her well. And she nodded and wiped her face and got into the car and drove away, and I stood there under the dim parking light and felt no hatred, no satisfaction, only a strange quiet release, like I had finally put something heavy down. And I returned my office and turned off the lights and locked the doors and stepped into the elevator, and when I reached the lobby I saw one of our night shift workers mopping the floors, and he looked up startled, and I smiled and thanked him for his work, and he smiled back wide and sincere and said, "Thank you, Mom. This place feels good, like it wants us to be here." And I nodded because he was right. This place did want us to be here, and it wanted to be something new, something better. And I stepped outside into the night air, crisp and clean, and I walked to my car with slow steps, unhurried, unafraid, because the girl who had once been laughed at, soaked, and humiliated had risen not just with revenge, but with purpose, and no one, not Marcus, not Brenda, not Danielle, not even the past itself, could strip that away from me ever again. The days that followed were filled with a rhythm I had never known in my life, a pace that felt both empowering and deeply grounding, as if each morning I woke up not to survive the next wave of chaos, but to truly shape something meaningful. And Wilson Heritage Restoration was no longer just a business or a building. It had become a breathing thing, a story with new chapters being written each day by hands that were not afraid to get dirty, and minds that believed in honoring the past while building the future. And I had begun leading a new restoration project involving the historic Stonemore Public Library, a place that had survived wars, floods, and political threats over the decades, but now stood on the brink of demolition until our bid had turned it into a symbol of resilience. And every time I stepped into the library's crumbling halls, I felt a connection to every person who had ever been told their voice did not matter because that building, much like me, had once been cast aside, and yet here it stood waiting to be restored. And as I climbed the cracked marble staircase on our first full day of assessment, I saw names etched into the stone balustrade, initials carved by teenagers decades ago, and I smiled, not because they had vandalized a historical space, but because it reminded me that even when we are young and invisible, we leave marks in the world we live in, and I had been leaving mine in silence for years, but now every blueprint, every meeting, every choice I made was a deliberate imprint of my values, and the team working with me had started calling the project Legacy Reclaimed. And I let the name stick because it captured what we were doing, reclaiming not just buildings, but identities, stories, dignity. And one afternoon, as we were cataloging salvaged wood panels and original brass fixtures, I got a call from the local museum asking if I would be willing to host a small exhibition on our work, showcasing some of the textiles I had restored before taking over the firm. And at first I hesitated because part of me still did not know how to stand in front of people and say, "This is mine, I did this, I made this matter." But then I thought of every time I had been silenced and erased, and I told the curator yes, and that I would personally walk them through the archive and select the right pieces. And that night I sat in my apartment, not the cold, sterile space I used to hide in, but a warm home filled with artifacts and textures that told my story, and I began pulling out sealed boxes and drawers, unrolling shawls from the 19th century with intricate threadwork that had once been nearly eaten away by age and sweat and neglect, and each fabric I touched reminded me of how far I had come and how many hours I had once spent hunched over a table with a magnifier and lamp, working alone in the back of the museum, while others were praised for projects I helped bring back to life. And now my name would be on the wall, and no one could steal it from me. And I arrived early on the day of the exhibit, dressed in a navy dress with sleeves rolled just enough to show the faded scar on my wrist from a broken tool during my first restoration. And I left it uncovered because that scar was part of my truth. And when people asked, I told them the story not for pity but for honesty, and the exhibit was quiet, intimate, filled with subtle lighting and soft classical music in the background, and there were placards beside each piece with my name in bold. And when I read them, I did not cry, I simply stood taller and thanked the past version of myself who had never stopped believing that one day her work would speak for itself. And toward the end of the night I stepped outside to get air and saw a figure leaning against the stone rail, and it was Zayn, looking at me like I had just built a cathedral with my bare hands, and he handed me a small velvet notebook and said it was from his grandmother, who used to keep notes on every rug and shawl she ever owned, and that he thought I would know what to do with it. And I opened it and saw sketches and thread counts and pressed flowers. And I whispered thank you and kissed him softly, not out of impulse, but out of certainty. And a week later, as the exhibit came to a close, I received a formal letter from the Heritage Board offering me a seat on their council. And for the first time I did not doubt if I deserved it. I accepted and began planning my first proposal, which would be to create a mentorship program for girls in preservation trades, because talent without access is a tragedy, and I would no longer let the doors stay locked just because they had been locked for me. And I scheduled the first workshop for the last week of September, and when the day arrived, the room was filled with young women from all backgrounds, some shy, some bold, all curious, and I stood before them and began by saying that restoration is not just about saving things, it is about remembering that what once was broken can be whole again. And they listened with wide eyes and open hearts, and afterward one of the girls came up to me and said she had never met someone who looked like her and talked like her, who did this kind of work. And I smiled and said now she had, and she could do even more. And as the weeks passed, Wilson Heritage Restoration became known not just for its excellence, but for its integrity. We were featured in journals, invited to panels, asked to consult on federal projects, and yet I never forgot why I had started, not for applause, not for revenge, but because I had something to give, and the world finally had to see it. And one afternoon, as I walked through the Stonemore Library, now halfway through its rebirth, I heard Brenda's voice echo through the marble atrium, and I turned to see her walking beside our CFO, carrying a stack of ledgers and explaining a tax break we could qualify for. And she saw me, and her eyes held no shame, just tired honesty, and I nodded and moved on, not because I had forgiven everything but because I had found peace that did not depend on her apology, and later that night I received a letter from the Historical Society thanking me for bringing not just the library back to life, but the neighborhood around it because local businesses had begun donating food and supplies. Volunteers were showing up to paint and clean, and the energy had shifted, and as I sat reading the letter with the light of the setting sun warming my skin, I thought of that wedding day not out of pain, but as a landmark, as the moment everything had begun to fall apart, so it could fall together. And now every time I walked into a room, I did not wonder who would mock me, or who would pity me. I walked in with the certainty of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to offer. And one evening Zayn and I returned to the rooftop garden, which had now become our quiet place, and he lit a candle and said we should name the new scholarship fund after my grandmother, who had taught me how to sew, and I said yes. And the next day I announced the Hazel Initiative, and the applications poured in, and as I read each one I saw fragments of myself in their stories, girls and women who had been told no too often and now finally had a place to start. And as I signed off on the first 5 recipients, I whispered under my breath that the cycle was broken and a new one had begun, and I promised to never forget where I came from, not to hold on to the pain, but to honor the strength it gave me. And as autumn deepened and the trees outside the office turned gold, I stood in the main hall watching a group of school children tour our exhibition, and when one of the little girls asked who built this place, our guide pointed to me and said she did, and the girls smiled and waved, and I waved back and thought to myself, yes, I did. I built this, I earned this, I became this, and nothing they took from me could ever compare to what I created on my own. The winter air settled in gently that year, not with the biting cruelty of seasons past, but with a hush that made everything feel reflective, as though the world itself had slowed down to give space for all that had changed, and I found myself walking to work most mornings wrapped in the coat I had once worn on the train the day I left my parents' house with no clear direction, and each step now felt like a declaration of survival and transformation. And Wilson Heritage Restoration had just secured a new city contract, a massive multi-site project that would stretch across old schools, train stations and marketplaces, and it came with more responsibility, more visibility, and more pressure than anything we had taken on before. And I sat in the main office one morning, reviewing the proposal packet, when our project manager Malik walked in and said we had been invited to present at the National Preservation Conference, and my breath caught in my throat because that conference had once been the very stage I was denied access to when I worked under Dr. Halberstam, and now not only was I attending, I would be speaking as a keynote, and I spent the next week preparing, carefully choosing my words, not to impress but to reveal, because this time I was not selling a product, I was sharing a truth. And when the day arrived, I walked onto that stage in front of hundreds of architects, historians, policymakers, and students, and I told the story of the Stonemore Library, not just as a building, but as a metaphor. And when I said that restoration begins when we stop pretending that cracks mean something is worthless and start believing that broken things are still worthy of beauty, the room went quiet, and when I stepped down I was met with applause, not the kind that fades quickly, but the kind that rises with respect, and I felt a deep shift inside, as though something that had been waiting for permission had finally been released. And afterward a woman approached me and introduced herself as the director of the Global Heritage Foundation, and she said my speech moved her and that she wanted to feature our work in their spring publication. And I nodded, stunned and humbled, and I gave her my card and promised to follow up. And over the next few weeks our office was flooded with interview requests, partnership offers, speaking invitations, and I carefully chose the ones that aligned with our mission, not chasing clout but building legacy. And one afternoon, as I stood in the newly painted south wing of the Wilson Building, I looked out the arched windows and saw a group of young interns sketching on the lawn, and I felt something so quiet and wholly settle over me, like the universe was nodding in approval. And that evening Zayn brought over fresh flatbread and tea, and we sat cross-legged on the rug in my living room, flipping through photo albums, and he paused on one where I was about 7 years old, standing next to a crooked birthday cake with icing sliding off the side. And he asked if I remembered that day, and I said yes, that was the year my sister had thrown a tantrum, because the cake had my name on it, and not hers, and I laughed not because it was funny, but because it no longer hurt, and Zayn reached out and traced the corner of the photo, and said I wish I had known you back then, and I said maybe you were not supposed to, maybe you were supposed to know me now, and he kissed me on the forehead, and we sat in silence listening to the wind outside, and the warmth of his presence filled the spaces that used to echo with loneliness. And the next morning I received email from Brenda asking if we could talk not about work, but about what had happened, and my fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before I typed sure, but only if you are ready for honesty, and she replied within minutes saying she was, and we met at a quiet cafe downtown, a place with wooden beams and hanging plants, and I wore no makeup, no mask, and when she walked in, she looked older, thinner, as if life had finally started showing on her face, and we sat down, and the first thing she said was I am sorry, and I did not interrupt her. I let her speak, let her stumble through her memories and justifications and regrets, and when she was done, I told her I appreciated the apology, but that it did not erase what had happened, and she nodded and said she understood, and that she was not asking for forgiveness, just for space to acknowledge it. And we parted with no promises, just the soft relief that comes from truth finally being spoken. And as I walked back to the office, I felt lighter, not because the weight was gone, but because I had stopped carrying what was never mine to begin with. And as spring approached, we launched our new apprenticeship program, bringing in 15 young women and men to learn trades from senior restorers, and I personally designed the curriculum to include not just technical skills, but history, ethics, community engagement. And I taught the first module myself, standing in the workshop with sleeves rolled up, showing them how to strip paint without damaging century-old oak. And as they watched with awe, I thought about how long it had taken me to believe that my knowledge had value, and now I was passing it on not out of obligation, but out of purpose. And one evening, after a long day, I received a wedding invitation in the mail, and when I opened it, my hand stilled. It was from my sister, and it was addressed to me alone, and the envelope was plain, but the card inside was ornate with gold trim, and a handwritten note that said I would love for you to come, not out of guilt or pressure, but because you are my sister. And I sat with the invitation for hours, not because I did not know my answer, but because I wanted to honor how far I had come since the last time I attended one of her weddings alone and broken. And this time, if I went, I would be arriving not as the forgotten sister, but as a whole woman. And I called Zayn and asked if he would come with me, and he said always. And the day of the wedding arrived on a crisp Saturday in late March, and I wore a soft green dress with vintage earrings from my grandmother. And when we walked into the hall hand in hand, heads turned not out of mockery, but surprise and maybe even admiration, and my mother stood frozen for a second and then gave me a tentative nod, and I nodded back. And during the ceremony, as my sister said her vows, I watched her eyes, and for the first time I saw something real, not performance, not vanity, just vulnerability. And afterwards she hugged me and said thank you, and I said you are welcome, and that was it. No grand reconciliation, no dramatic confrontation, just two women who had finally accepted that the past could not be rewritten, but the present could be faced with grace. And as we left the hall, Zayn squeezed my hand and said you did not flinch once, and I smiled and said I stopped flinching the day I realized I never needed their approval to matter. And that night, as I took off my shoes and wiped off my lipstick, I looked in the mirror and saw not a survivor, not a fighter, but a creator, a woman who had built something lasting from the ruins of her past. And I whispered to my reflection, you made it. And the wind outside howled not in warning, but in celebration, and I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and let the warmth of everything I had become carry me into the quiet peace of sleep. After the wedding ended and life returned to its usual rhythm, I found myself waking up with a new kind of calm, a peace I had not felt in years, as if every silent battle I had once fought had finally laid down its arms, and for the first time in a long while I no longer waited for the next storm. I simply existed in the stillness that followed, and work continued at Wilson Heritage Restoration with more momentum than ever before. We were taking on larger projects, more cities, more communities, and I found myself not just as a leader, but as a mentor guiding young women who reminded me of the girls I used to be. Filled with ideas and doubt and fire, and one of them, Layla, stayed late one evening trying to fix a historic mosaic that had been damaged during shipment, and I sat beside her on the cold stone floor and taught her how to gently lift each tile and reset it with precision, and she looked at me with wide eyes and asked, "Did you always know you would end up here?" And I laughed softly and said, "No, I just knew I could not stay where I was, and sometimes that is enough to start." And the next day I received a call from the editor of a leading architecture journal, asking to feature my story, not just the company but my personal journey. And while part of me hesitated, wary of exposure, another part of me whispered, "This is what healing looks like, not hiding," and I agreed. And during the interview I spoke plainly, not embellishing anything, just sharing how every rejection, every dismissal, every moment of feeling unseen had pushed me to build a space where no one would ever be made to feel like that again. And when the article came out, the response was overwhelming. Letters, emails, messages from women who had walked away from homes, jobs, families, and found pieces of themselves in my story. And I read every word slowly, sometimes with tears, sometimes with a soft smile, and I kept a folder labeled "Voices of Courage," because I knew I was not the only one walking this road. I was just one of the few who had dared to speak, and one afternoon, while sorting through those messages, I came across one from my father. Not a long note, just a simple line: "I read your interview and I am proud," and I stared at the screen, unsure if I was angry or relieved. And in the end I felt neither, only a deep exhaustion, because those words should have come when I was 13, when I won the science fair, and no one showed up when I was 17 and drove myself to the college entrance exam with no good luck or packed lunch. And now they felt like a door that opened too late, and I did not respond. I just closed the email and went back to sanding the arch of an old chapel, because some things need not be answered to be understood. And later that week, Zayn surprised me with a weekend trip to the countryside, a quiet inn with wooden beams and a small lake. And we spent 2 days doing absolutely nothing. We lay under the trees, we made bread in the tiny kitchen, we danced in socks across the wooden floors, and on. Last night he handed me a small box. Inside was a pendant shaped like a key, and he said, "This is not a proposal, not yet. This is me saying you hold the key to everything I want." And I cried, not the loud kind, but the soft shaking kind, because love like that does not arrive in grand gestures, it arrived in consistent presence. And I wore the key every day tucked under my collar, close to my heartbeat. And as the weeks passed, our company won a national award for cultural preservation, and we were invited to present our techniques at the United Nations Heritage Summit. And I flew to Geneva with a small team and stood in a hall filled with world leaders and preservationists. And I spoke of forgotten neighborhoods, of histories erased, of beauty hidden behind neglect. And when I finished, the applause felt global, like the earth itself had heard and approved. And after the summit I walked alone through the old city, tracing cobblestones with my boots, and I thought of my younger self sitting on the floor of my childhood bedroom, wondering if anyone would ever see her worth. And I whispered into the wind, "She sees it now." And when I returned, I found a letter waiting on my desk from Brenda again, this time longer, more open. She spoke of therapy, of confronting her own jealousy, of learning that strength is not a limited resource. And I wrote back, not to rekindle anything, but to acknowledge her growth and say, "I hope you keep healing." And she replied, "I will," and that was enough. And as spring deepened into summer, our office hosted an open house to celebrate our 5th year, and people came from every city, from every neighborhood we had touched. And my mother arrived unannounced. She stood in the corner for a long time, watching me speak with guests, tour the site, answer questions. And at the end she came to me and said, "I used to think you were running away, but I see now you were running towards something." And I nodded, not because I forgave her entirely, but because I understood that even a small step from her took more than she could say. And later that evening I stood on the roof of the building, looking out at the skyline lit by the sunset, and I remembered the girl who had walked into her sister's wedding alone, and I thought about how far she had come, and how she had not only healed but built a life so wide and rich, that even her past had to stretch to make room, and I turned to Zayn, who had come up behind me and said, "I think I am ready," and he said, "For what?" And I said, "To write my own vows someday," and he smiled the kind of smile that feels like morning, and said, "Then let us build the rest together," and in that moment I knew that life had come full circle, not in the way stories end, but in the way they begin again, stronger, clearer, fuller, and I held his hand as the wind rushed past us, carrying with it the echoes of every no I had turned into a yes. As summer burned into the horizon and the days stretched longer than they felt real, I began to reflect on everything I had become, not just the milestones or the recognition, but the quieter triumphs, like how I no longer flinched at the sound of my mother's voice, or how I stopped looking over my shoulder when I walked into boardrooms filled with men who once would have dismissed me before I even sat down. And the new season brought with it not only heat but invitations from universities requesting me to speak to young architects, especially women, who wanted to know how to survive in a field where legacy often outweighed innovation, and I accepted a lecture slot at my alma mater, a place I had once fled from in the dead of night, after an argument with my father about how tradition was choking vision, and stepping into those halls again wearing a tailored suit with my company's badge pinned at my collar. It felt like walking into a dream I had rewritten line by line, and I stood in front of the same auditorium where years ago I sat in the back row, ashamed of how invisible I felt, and I told them everything, not just about the renovations or the awards, but about the loneliness. Silence, the pain of being laughed at when you dared to dream too loudly, and after the talk a girl with ink-stained fingers and eyes full of fire asked me if success would make the hurt go away, and I told her no, it would not, but it would give the pain a purpose, and that was enough to keep going. And back at the firm, we were launching a new mentorship program for underprivileged youth, pairing them with restoration artists and site engineers. And on the first day, I walked into the training room to see a group of teens huddled around sketches, laughing and arguing in that raw, unfiltered way that only teenagers can, and I saw myself in one of them, a girl with braids and worn-out shoes, who kept her eyes on the floor until I asked her what she thought about the structure's arch, and she looked up surprised, then said it was wrong, that the angle was too steep and would never hold weight, and she was right, and from that moment she never looked down again, and we hired her that winter as a junior apprentice, and I knew then that legacy was not about buildings or names on plaques. It was about opening doors wide enough for others to walk through without ever shrinking themselves to fit. And one evening, while finalizing the layout for a municipal project, I got a call from a number I did not recognize, and when I answered I heard a voice I had not heard in over a year. Danielle. She sounded tired but soft, and she said she was sorry for everything again, but that this time it was not about forgiveness. She just wanted to tell me she was moving to a different state, that she had gotten a job as a housing advocate for women fleeing abusive relationships, and she said she wanted to help rebuild lives. And when I asked what made her choose that path, she said, "Your story," and I felt the air leave my lungs, and I told her good luck, and I meant it. And after we hung up, I sat alone in the office watching the evening light spill over the wooden beams, and I realized some echoes soften if you stop shouting back at them. And a few days later, Brenda dropped by unannounced. She brought with her a tray of lemon bars, the same ones she used to make during holidays when the house still felt whole, and she placed them on my desk and said nothing for a long moment, just looked at the walls, the plants, the space that once belonged to her husband and now carried only my fingerprints, and then she sat and asked how I was, and I said I was well, that the work was fulfilling, and that the team was growing, and she nodded and then said softly, "I never thought it would be you, not because you were not smart, but because I was too afraid to believe in the version of you that challenged everything we built." And I told her she did not have to explain anymore, that I had stopped waiting for answers and had started living mine, and she blinked fast and then said, "I start art school next month," and I smiled, not out of mockery, but because I understood how hard that decision must have been, and I wished her luck. And she said thank you and left, and as I watched her go, I realized healing was not always mutual. Sometimes you grow and others catch up, or they do not, but either way you keep growing. And one evening, Zayn and I walked through the local museum where one of our restored stained glass projects was being exhibited under golden light, and he reached for my hand as we stared at the mural, and said, "I want to build something like this with you, not in glass or stone, but in moments and memories." And I asked, "Are you proposing?" And he said, "Not yet, but when I do, it will not be in front of crowds or cameras. It will be just us and a future too wide to measure." And I nodded because I had stopped needing the world's validation. I only needed truth, and it was standing right beside me. And that week, and we took a trip to the coastal town where we had first met for a conference so many years ago, and we walked the shoreline barefoot, laughing and remembering how unsure everything had once felt and now how right it all was. And we sat on driftwood as the sun dipped low, and he looked at me and said, "I never told you this, but the first time I saw you, I knew you were building something the world was not ready for." And I smiled because I had always known, and now the world was finally catching up. And when we returned home, I received an invitation from the city council. They wanted to name one of our restored libraries after me, and I declined politely, not because I was not honored, but because I wanted the building to carry a name of the first woman who designed it in the 1800s, a name long erased from the records, and they agreed. And when the ribbon was cut, and her name was etched on the front steps, I felt something settle in my chest, a peace not born from praise, but from justice. And as autumn came sweeping in, I realized I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not my parents, not my sister, not even the world, because my life was the loudest proof, and it spoke in buildings, in communities, in love, in silence, and that was more than enough. As the year slowly moved toward its final months, I found myself stepping back more often, not from the work or the momentum, but from the noise. I wanted to observe quietly, to feel the shape of my days, and whether they still held meaning beyond movement. And it was during one of those reflective mornings that I sat at my desk in the quiet of the office and opened a journal I had kept since the year 2010, pages filled with small victories, old sketches, private thoughts, and long-buried questions. And I flipped through the entries and found one written in shaky handwriting. It read, "I wonder if I will ever walk into a room and not feel like I have to shrink to be safe." And as I read that line, I placed my hand over it, as if trying to comfort the girl who had written it, and I realized that I had answered her without even noticing. I had become the woman who took up space fully, proudly, without apology. And later that day, as the team gathered around for a celebration of our recent grant approval, someone brought out a cake with the words "Dream it, build it, live it," and everyone clapped, and Zayn stood beside me beaming with pride, and in the middle of the room, surrounded by people I had once only dreamed of leading, I felt a quiet tear roll down my cheek, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of gratitude. And just then I received a message from an unknown number. The preview read, "I did not know how to face you," and I opened it carefully. It was from my sister Danielle, and she had written a long message detailing her divorce, her move to a small town, and how she had recently started volunteering at a community center. She wrote, "I still do not expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that your strength taught me how to start over." And though part of me bristled at the timing, I also knew that pain had changed her, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. And I replied simply, "I wish you peace." And as I hit send, I felt no anger, no resentment, only the kind of clarity that arrives when you stop expecting closure to come wrapped in apology. And the next week, I was invited to deliver a keynote speech at an international restoration summit in Portugal. The invitation alone felt surreal. And when I stood on the grand stage in a foreign country speaking about techniques we developed from forgotten architecture and old city corners, I ended by sharing my personal journey, how I once walked into a wedding alone, feeling like I was nothing, only to realize that solitude was never the absence of value, and the room stood in applause. And after the event, a woman from South Africa approached me in tears and said I was going to give up on my application design school, but now I will not. And we hugged without needing words, and I knew then that sometimes we live out answers for questions others have not even spoken yet. And after returning home, we were asked to partner on a government-funded preservation plan for historic schools across the nation. It was the biggest contract we had ever seen, and while everyone celebrated, I walked outside onto the terrace where the sky was soft with dusk, and I whispered thank you not to anyone in particular, just to the path that never gave up on me even when I nearly did. And that night Zayn and I sat on the floor of our apartment eating takeout from our favorite local stall, and we talked about everything and nothing. And in the middle of laughter, he suddenly turned serious and said, "I know you said you were not ready for a proposal, but I am." And before I could respond, he placed a velvet box between us. Inside was not a ring but a compass etched with my name, and he said, "Wherever you go, lead me there." And I cried again, because I had once begged someone to see me, to believe in me, to follow me, and now someone was choosing to walk beside me, not out of pity or guilt, but out of genuine respect and love. And I said yes, not to marriage but to life with him, and the next morning I wore the compass around my neck, and it felt like armor and wings all at once. And as autumn painted the city in golds and reds, I took some time away from work, just a few weeks, to breathe, to write, to wander. And during one of those quiet afternoons I received a formal letter from my father. He had written about his retirement, about how the house now felt too big, too quiet, and how sometimes he looked at the empty chair at the table and thought of me. And he ended with, "I still do not understand everything you did, but I am starting to understand why." And I did not write back, but I placed the letter in my journal right next to that entry from 2010, and I realized that some things do not need a reply, only a place to rest. And when I returned to the office, the team had completed the final phase of our largest project to date, a heritage village restored to reflect its original cultural roots. And during the unveiling ceremony, as children played in the streets and elders shared stories under the restored archways, I stood quietly at the edge, letting the moment belong to the people, and Zayn came beside me, holding my hand, and said, "Look what you gave them." And I said, "No, look what they always had. I just cleared the dust." And that night we drove back in silence, both of us wrapped in the feeling of something good, something whole. And as the city lights welcomed us back, I thought about the girl who once believed that being alone meant being unwanted, and now that same girl had created a space so large, so warm, that even those who once mocked her now found comfort in its glow. And I slept that night with the windows open, letting the wind carry away the last remains of anything that had ever told me I was not enough. The cold settled slowly over the city with the kind of quiet that made you think about everything you had been avoiding, and one morning I woke to a silence so thick it felt like the past had sat beside me again, not to haunt me, but to ask if I had really let go. And I got out of bed, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and walked barefoot across the floor, thinking about all the versions of myself that had walked this same path, each one a little stronger, a little less afraid. And as I made tea, I stared at the steam curling from the cup and remembered the first time I had stood alone at my sister's wedding, every laugh, every sneer, every whisper of pity echoing around me like I was not supposed to exist. And now all those voices had faded like background noise, replaced by my own voice, firm, clear, and no longer waiting for permission. And at the office we were preparing for our end-of-year community celebration, something small and warm, meant to bring together the people who had supported us from the start. And I made a point of writing personal notes to every staff member, every volunteer, every builder and architect who had laid even one brick in this journey. And it was during that process that I came across a name I had not seen in years, Jordan, one of the first contractors I had hired when we were just beginning. And I remembered how he had stood by me when a supplier tried to cancel our materials last minute simply because he did not want to deal with a female project lead. And Jordan had said, "If she leaves, I leave," and he never asked for praise or credit. And I searched for him and found out he had moved to another city, and I sent him a long message, not just thanking him, but telling him that small act had given me courage on the days I felt like crumbling. And he replied saying, "I always knew you would make it," and reading that made something settle in me, like another piece of the foundation had been reinforced. And during that same week, I received an unexpected package from my mother, a small wooden box filled with old family photographs, letters, and one tiny pair of shoes I had worn as a toddler, with a note that read, "I thought you might want to know where you came from." And I stared at the box for a long time, not sure whether to laugh or cry. And in the end I did both, because memory is strange. It can hurt and heal in the same breath, and I took the box to my bedroom, placed it under the bed, and told myself that sometimes acknowledgement is the only apology we will get, and that has to be enough. And the community event arrived with music, laughter, lights, and the smell of roasted corn in the air, and I stood by the welcome gate, greeting every face with a smile, and people came in waves, some bringing flowers, others carrying homemade treats, and one woman pulled me aside and said my son used to skip school, now he wants to become an architect because he saw someone like you on the news, and my throat tightened, and I hugged her like she was family, because in that moment she was. And later in the evening, during the open mic, I was asked to say a few words, and I stood before the crowd with my notes trembling slightly, and said I used to think I had to be alone to become strong, but now I know strength is built in the company of those who believe in you. And as the night ended and people left with full hearts and warm hands, I walked through the quiet streets with Zayn, and he asked if I ever imagined this life, and I said not in detail, but I always imagined freedom, and this feels like it. And the next morning I received a call from the city council informing me that our team had been selected to design the restoration plan for the oldest library in the region, a project that would not just be about brick and paint, but about legacy and learning, and I felt like all the hours spent dreaming, scribbling, sketching, and failing had finally come full circle. And I stood before my team that afternoon and shared the news, and the room erupted in cheers, and I looked at every face and thought, these are the people I would go to war with and win. And that evening, after everyone had left, I stayed behind, walking through the quiet halls, running my fingers along the exposed beams, the polished railings, the gallery walls filled with photos of our completed projects, and I whispered thank you not just to the space, but to every moment that had brought me here. And when I got home, Zayn had cooked dinner and lit candles and played soft jazz, and we danced slowly in the living room, and he said, "You are glowing," and I said, "Maybe I am finally reflecting the light I always had," and he held me tighter, and I felt safe and whole. And later, as we sat watching the city lights from our balcony, he said, "Do you think your family will ever truly come around?" And I said, "I no longer wait for them to, because I have built a family out of kindness, truth, and choice, and that is enough." And he nodded and said, "Then let us keep building." And in that moment I knew that love was not always found in those who shared your blood, but in those who shared your burdens and your dreams. And the next day I received an email from my old college professor inviting me to speak at the university's winter symposium on resilience in creative leadership. And I accepted, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I wanted the younger generation to know that pain can be turned into purpose. And when the day came, I stood on stage looking out at rows of students' notebooks, open eyes wide, and I said I failed more times than I can count. I was laughed at, dismissed, overlooked, but I never left the table. I kept showing up, and eventually the world had to make room for me. And when I finished, the applause was soft, respectful, like they understood this was not a story of success, but of survival. And afterward a girl approached me, eyes brimming with tears, and said, "Thank you for being proof that we do not have to stay small to stay safe." And I hugged her and whispered, "You are allowed to be seen." And as I walked back through the campus paths I had once walked as a student, uncertain and invisible, I felt like I was walking beside every version of myself, telling them, "You made it." And when I got home that night, Zayn had left a note on the table that read, "Proud of you always," and I smiled, knowing that no matter how far I went, I had someone to come home to, someone who saw me fully even on the days I could not. And as the year ended, I stood on the rooftop of our office, once again watching fireworks in the distance, and I closed my eyes and said goodbye to everything I had outgrown, and hello to everything I had yet to become. The morning after the winter symposium, I sat at my desk watching the soft light spill across the floor, while my inbox filled with messages from students thanking me for speaking, and one of them wrote, "I was going to quit architecture school this year, but now I think I'll stay and fight." And that line stayed with me longer than I expected, because I remembered a time when all I wanted was someone to tell me I was allowed to stay and fight too. And as I sipped my tea, I heard Zayn in the kitchen humming, and I smiled, because this was the peace I had once prayed for in silence, and now it lived with me like it belonged. And as the day went on, I received a formal invitation to speak at a global urban design conference in the capital city, scheduled for late March, and the panel was titled "Women Who Built from Rubble," and I read the words twice before accepting, because I knew what it meant for someone like me to be on a stage like that, and in the weeks that followed I began preparing my talk while also managing the restoration blueprint for the historical library project, and the team was energized, pouring themselves into the research, the renderings, the heritage preservation laws, and every single person treated the project not just like a job, but like a mission, and we spent hours debating color palettes, window moldings, tile texture, and every evening when I walked home, I felt proud, exhausted, and lit up from within. And then one afternoon, as I was returning from a material inspection, I received a call from Jasmine, and though I had ignored many of her attempts to contact me, something in me told me to answer, and her voice was quiet, hesitant. She said, "I know you probably do not want to hear from me, but I am getting married again, and I just wanted to say I understand now why you walked alone, and I wanted to say I am sorry." And I did not speak for a moment, just let the silence pass like a tide before I said, "I hope you are happy truly." And she said, "I am learning to be." And I said, "Then that is a good start." And when I hung up, I did not cry or shake or feel rage. Instead, I felt still, like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. And a few days later, I got a letter from my father, hand written on the back of a blueprint from his old office. And he said, "I was too proud to say it back then, but I watched your first interview, and I want you to know I am proud of you." And though it was late, and though the years between us were scarred with silence, I folded that letter and placed it beside my mother's box of memories and said aloud, "I forgive you, and not for you, but for me and the team." And I continued our work on the library project, meeting with historians, community leaders, old librarians who shared stories about children who had once read there, and grandmothers who had taught classes in its halls, and we sketched stories into the very walls, deciding to embed brass plaques with community quotes in the reading rooms, and mosaic tiles made from donated ceramic in the children's area. And one evening during a budget meeting, I got a call from the organizing board of the Urban Design Conference, asking if I would be willing to close the event as the keynote speaker. And I felt my heart race, because this meant that I was not just being heard, I was being trusted to carry the final message. And I accepted with a calm voice, but my hands were trembling. And I told Zayn later that night, and he kissed my forehead and said, "You have always been the keynote, you just didn't know it yet." And I laughed and told him, "You are my favorite architect." And he said, "I only build safe places, and you are mine." And in late March I flew to the capital city, and the hotel they booked for me had a view of the skyline and the river that snaked through the city like a ribbon of silver. And I rehearsed my speech over and over until it flowed from me like breath. And when the day arrived, I wore a simple gray suit, the same color as the bricks from our first construction site, and I walked into the auditorium with my head held high. And when I stepped on stage, I saw faces from every continent watching, waiting, and I began by saying, "I am not here because I had the best grades or the highest scores. I am here because I did not quit even when I had every reason to." And I spoke about resilience, and about rage turned into architecture, and about how healing sometimes comes in the shape of a staircase or a skylight. And when I finished, the room rose in applause, not loud but deep. Like they had not just heard me, they had felt me. And afterward I was approached by a woman from Germany who said, "Your story reminded me of my daughter, and I hope she finds her voice too." And a man from Kenya who said, "We need people like you designing for the people, not just the papers." And I walked out of the auditorium into the evening air, and I cried, but it was the kind of cry that feels like a final stone being lifted from your chest. And when I returned home, I found that the library project had made national news, and the headline read, "Once dismissed as a dreamer, she is now designing history." And I cut out the article and mailed a copy to my old university with a note that read, "Thank you for not choosing me." And then I sat with my team, and we raised glasses of sweet chai and toasted to every no that brought us to this yes. And the grand opening of the restored library was set early summer, and we invited the entire community, and people showed up in waves, elders, children, teachers. And when the ribbon was cut, there was no celebrity, no politician, just a girl who once walked into a wedding alone, now standing on the steps of a building she helped bring back to life. And as Doors opened and people walked through. I stood at the back watching them touch the walls, read the plaques, smile, and I whispered to myself, this is what healing looks like. And afterward, as the crowd thinned, my mother approached me with teary eyes, and she held my hand and said, I don't know how to ask for forgiveness, so I will just say thank you. And I said, we don't need to look back anymore, let's just keep walking. And she hugged me for the first time in years, and for a moment I was a child again, held safe and seen. And that evening I sat on the library rooftop with Zayn watching the sky turn lavender, and I told him, I think I am finally free. And he said, you have always been free, you just stopped believing you needed permission. And I looked at him and said, I want to build more, not just buildings, but bridges. And he said, then let us start tomorrow. And in that moment, I knew that everything I had lived through, every betrayal, every lonely step had been laying the path for this life, and I would not change a thing. And as we walked home, I saw a little girl pointing at the building, saying to her mother, I want to build something like that one day. And I smiled, knowing the story was no longer just mine. It had become part of something bigger, something lasting, something that would carry forward long after I was gone. And when we reached our doorstep, I turned back for one last look at the skyline, where dreams were now drawn in steel and glass and love. After the intense whirlwind of everything that had unfolded, I found myself waking up in silence, but this time it was not the kind of silence that echoed with loneliness or pain. It was a calm, deep silence like the one that falls on a city before dawn, still and full of possibility. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the soft rays of sunlight stream through the sheer curtains, and I realized I had not thought about Jasmine or that wedding in days, and it felt like a victory, not loud or explosive, but quiet and steady and honest. I had been pouring myself into work. The library restoration project was in full motion, and my name was finally being recognized, not for being someone's sister or daughter, but for the work I had carved with my own hands and mind. The firm had taken notice of the dedication and commitment I brought into every blueprint, every consultation, and though the praise came in small waves, it was genuine and earned. One afternoon during a client meeting, the director of the firm asked me to present the new concept to the board. And though I felt the nerves stirring in my stomach, I stood up, clicked open the projector, and let my voice carry the vision I had been building in my mind for months. I talked about sustainable materials, community, inclusive design, and how old spaces deserved not to be torn down but reimagined. And by the end of the meeting, not only had the board approved the plan, they also invited me to lead the design implementation. And that was the first time I felt the weight of my past slide off my shoulders, not because I had forgotten it, but because it no longer defined me in that boardroom. I was not the sister who walked alone, or the girl who was laughed at. I was the architect of something bigger, something lasting. In the days that followed, I found myself smiling more, the kind of smile that comes from within, not forced or polite, just honest and free. I started walking to work again, taking longer routes just to feel the sun on my face and the rhythm of the city around me. I would pass the bakery near the corner, and the owner would wave, remembering my usual order from the old days, and it reminded me that even when everything changes, some threads of your story quietly hold on. And one evening, as I sat working late on material sourcing, Zayn knocked on my office door with 2 paper cups of coffee and said, you have to eat. And I smiled because he always knew when I was overworking without saying it out loud. We sat on the steps outside the office, sipping coffee, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. And I told him I never imagined my life would look like this, and he said, that is because you were taught imagine small, and now you are finally thinking in your own scale. And I rested my head on his shoulder and let the truth of that settle into my bones. And then one Friday morning, my email pinged with a message from the National Urban Renewal Council. They had seen the conceptual design I presented and wanted to feature my work in an upcoming exhibition. I reread the message 3 times to be sure it was real. Then I stared at the screen in stunned silence, realizing this was the kind of moment I had once thought only happened to other people. But now it was mine, and I accepted the invitation immediately and started preparing my portfolio, pulling together not just images and plans, but also handwritten notes and storyboards, because I wanted the exhibition to reflect not just the structures but the story behind every design, the story of a woman who had once been told she was too emotional Too inexperienced, too soft, and now was being called a visionary. I printed every piece of material myself, mounted them with care, and sent the parcel off with shaking hands and hopeful eyes. The following week, as I sat in a planning meeting for the library project, I noticed a small envelope tucked between the pages of a delivery folder, and when I opened it, I found a handwritten note from the youngest intern on our team. She wrote, "You taught me that strength does not have to be loud. Thank you for showing me what leadership looks like." And I blinked hard, trying to swallow the lump in my throat, because I had not realized anyone was watching me like that, and that note became something I taped on the inside of my sketchbook as a quiet reminder that every step I took forward was leaving a trail for someone else to follow. And in the quiet of my apartment that night, I lit a candle, placed the note next to it, and whispered thank you to whatever force had kept me standing all those nights I had felt like falling. The exhibition was scheduled for the second week of March, and I flew to the capital with a simple carry-on, a folder of my presentation, and a heart full of emotions I could barely name. The gallery was pristine, all glass and white walls with tall ceilings and soft instrumental music playing, and I walked through the space until I saw my corner set up with spotlights and elegant frames, and people were already gathered around, murmuring, reading, pointing, and as I approached I heard someone say she built this entire plan from salvaged brick and community input, and I felt my breath catch because they were talking about me not with doubt or disdain, but with admiration. I stood back watching them engage with my work, letting it speak for itself, and when a panelist invited me to speak, I walked to the small podium and shared the journey behind each design, how the ideas were born from lived experience, and how healing was not always a straight line. Sometimes it looped through heartbreak before arriving at purpose, and after I finished, the applause was warm, genuine, and I stepped off the stage with tears pressing at the edge of my eyes because I had not cried in front of strangers in years, but this time it felt like celebration, not sadness. After the exhibition, I was approached by a representative from an international firm asking if I would consider mentoring young women in design, and I said yes without hesitation because I knew what it meant to be a girl with ideas and no one to guide them. And as I returned home, I was greeted by messages from people across cities, women saying thank you for making space for us, and I read each one slowly, letting their words soak into my skin like balm. And the library project was now in final phases, with painters, artisans, and landscapers working tirelessly to meet the opening deadline. And every day I visited the site, talking with each worker, learning their names and stories, because I wanted them to know they were not just laborers, they were creators. And when the final tile was laid and the lights were tested, I stood in the middle of the grand reading room, surrounded by restored shelves, warm lighting, and community murals. And I closed my eyes for a second to breathe in the moment, and I remembered the day I had walked into my sister's wedding alone, and how everyone had laughed like my solitude was shameful. But now I stood in the center of something magnificent, and not a single person could take that from me. And that evening, as we packed up for the soft opening event, Zayn handed me a small wrapped box, and inside was a tiny brass compass engraved with the words, "Your direction is your power." And I hugged him tightly and whispered thank you for never doubting me. And he said I never had to, because your heart is louder than your fears. And I smiled as the first guests arrived to preview the space. Community leaders, former teachers, students, elders, and as they walked through the library, touching the polished wood, reading the plaques, admiring the murals, I heard gasps and laughter and stories being shared, and I knew we had built more than a library. We had built belonging. And late into the night, as we closed up the doors, I stayed back for one last walk through the rooms, letting the quiet speak to me. And I whispered, "I am proud of you," to the girl I used to be, the one who sat alone on stone steps with tear-stained cheeks and broken dreams, because she had made it all the way here. The night before the official library opening, I stayed at the site much later than planned. The workers had gone home, the lights were dimmed, and only the glow from the hallway sconces painted gentle shadows across the newly polished floors. And there in that silence I walked from room to room, as if I were meeting each one for the first time. The shelves had been filled, the reading corners were arranged with soft cushions and lamps, and the walls displayed the artwork of schoolchildren from the neighborhood, each one capturing in colored strokes what the word community meant to them. And I ran my hand along the edge of the long oak table in the main hall where once I had stood with sketches rolled under my arm, wondering if this place would ever become more than just a forgotten shell, and now it breathed with life and promise, and I realized I had stopped seeking anyone's approval a long time ago, including my family's, because what mattered more was the peace I found in building something real and lasting. I walked to the back garden space where a few benches had been set up, and in the middle was a small stone circle meant for storytelling sessions, a teacher's idea from the early planning meetings, and as I stood there I remembered my younger self always sitting quietly at the edge of every room, afraid to speak, afraid to be seen. And I wanted to reach back in time and tell her that one day she would be the one creating spaces for others to speak, to be seen, to matter. The next morning was bright with a clear sky and soft wind, perfect for an opening, and I arrived early wearing a white linen dress with a thin silver bracelet, the only piece of jewelry I wore regularly because it was a gift from my grandmother, and it made me feel grounded and connected. As the event began, guests started arriving, community leaders, school teachers, parents, children, and even a few architects from the city firm. And I greeted them all with a calm smile, walking them through the spaces, telling the story behind each detail, the reclaimed wood, the handmade tiles, the scent of lavender that filled quiet rooms. And then I saw her standing by the main entrance, dressed in her usual bold colors. Was my sister Jasmine. I had not invited her, but I also had not stopped her, and behind her stood my parents and a few other extended family members, their faces unreadable, and for a moment the air in my chest felt tight, but I stood straight, nodded at them politely, and returned to guiding the guests. I had no intention of pretending or performing, not anymore after the main tour. A local journalist asked if I would do a short interview for the paper, and I agreed, so we sat on the front steps of the library, and she asked what inspired me to lead this project, and I told her simply I wanted to prove that restoration is possible, not just in buildings, but in people too, and that sometimes the best way to heal is to create something that helps others heal too. And she looked at me with soft eyes and said, "That will be the headline," and I laughed quietly because it felt right. After the guests began to trickle out, my team and I sat in the back room sharing soft drinks and leftover cupcakes someone had brought, and we laughed and toasted. And when it grew quiet again, I stepped outside for air and found Jasmine sitting alone on one of the garden benches, and for a second I thought about turning around, but then I remembered how far I had come and decided to walk over. She looked up and said, "This place is beautiful," and I said thank you and stood quietly beside her, and after a moment she said, "I did not come to make a scene," and I nodded because I knew she did not. And then she said, "I used to think you were weak because you walked away from us, but now I think maybe you were the strongest one." And I looked at her and said I did not walk away, I just stopped walking toward people who never met me halfway. And she looked down at her hands and said, "I was jealous of you. You always had this light even when things were hard, and I hated that about you because I could not understand it." And I let her words sit between us, not rushing to fill the silence. And then she asked, "Do you ever think we can be close again?" And I said, "I do not know, maybe, but not because of guilt or blood, but because of growth." And she nodded slowly and said, "Fair enough." And we sat there for a few more minutes, watching the wind move through the trees like old music. And then she stood and left without another word, and I stayed there a while, feeling neither victory nor bitterness, just clarity. Later that night, I sat in my apartment floor, surrounded by notes, drawings, letters, and photos from the project, and I lit a candle, placed my sketchbook beside it, and wrote a single sentence across the last page: "We built something beautiful, and no one can take that from us." And as I stared at those words, I felt a warmth in my chest, a kind of knowing that no longer needed external confirmation. My phone buzzed with a message from Zayn. It said, "Proud of you always," and I smiled because he was the one person who had never needed convincing. And then a few minutes later, I got another message from the City Architecture Council, saying the library had been selected for a Design Excellence Award, and that they wanted me to speak at the upcoming conference in June. And I sat there frozen for a second, then let out a long breath because this was the kind of moment that once lived only in my dreams and now it was reaching out to touch me in real life. I texted back, immediately accepting, and then opened my old journal, the one I had written in back when everything was broken, and I flipped to a random page where I had once scribbled, "No one sees me," and I whispered, "Not true anymore." The next morning, I packed my bag to visit the library again, this time not for work, but just to sit in the space as a visitor. And when I arrived, a small group of children were gathered in the storytelling circle, listening to a volunteer read out loud, and I sat on the far bench watching them giggle, whisper, raise their hands, and I realized that this was always the point, not the recognition, not the applause, but the ripple, the quiet impact that keeps moving long after you leave the room. I stayed there most of the day talking to visitors, helping a teacher find a specific book for her students, and even running into an elderly man who said he had proposed to his wife in this building 50 years ago, and was grateful it was not torn down, and I told him, "Your story is part of this building," and he smiled and said, "Then it is in good hands." And when the sun started to dip, I walked home slowly with tired feet and a full heart, and when I reached my apartment door, there was a small envelope taped to it, with no name, just my address. Inside was a handwritten note from one of the students I had mentored last year. It said, "I used to think success looked like loud stages and bright lights, but then I met you and realized it also looks like quiet rooms filled with books." And I cried then, not from pain, but from the overwhelming grace of it all. And as the night closed in, I sat by my window watching the city lights blink and remembered the way my family laughed at me at that wedding years ago, how they had made me feel like I was less than, how Jasmine had turned her back, how my parents had looked the other way. And I realized something important: they had laughed because they did not understand me, they had dismissed me, because they could not measure me with their usual yardsticks. But none of that mattered anymore, because I had built a life so full, so meaningful, that even their silence could not undo it. And tomorrow I would begin preparing for the design conference in June. I would print out the plans, polish notes, and maybe even wear the same linen dress, because it reminded me of that day the library opened and everything changed, and I promised myself that no matter what happened next, I would always return to that garden bench in my mind, the one where I stood tall, not in defiance, but in peace, because I had found my voice and I was never giving it up again. The morning sun poured in through the window, and for once I let it hit my face without rushing to move or hide from the light. I had nowhere to be, and no one waiting to pull me into their drama, which felt like freedom in its simplest form. I got out of bed slowly, like my body was finally catching up with the pace of my spirit. I made tea in silence and watched the steam rise while my thoughts wandered to everything that had brought me here, all the pain, the betrayal, the moments I had swallowed my truth just to keep peace, that never truly existed. And I felt something shift deep inside me, not loud transformation, but a quiet certainty that I would never go back to being the girl who stayed quiet just to make others comfortable around mid-morning. I opened my inbox and saw a new message from Jasmine. She had written a long apology again. This time she said she understood if I needed more time, but she hoped one day we could talk, not to argue or defend, but to simply understand each other. I read every word slowly, and though part of me wanted to delete it without thinking, I found myself reading it again, this time with less anger and more curiosity. Was she really trying to change, or was this another performance crafted by guilt? Only time would tell. But for the first time I did not feel that heaviness in my chest. I responded with a short message that simply said, "Thank you for reaching out. I am not sure what the future holds, but I appreciate your honesty." And then I closed my laptop and let it be. I had a long walk ahead, the kind of walk that had no destination, just me and the open road. And as I stepped outside, the air smelled like new beginnings, soft and cool, with a trace of jasmine in the wind, which made me smile because for some strange reason, even memories can be ironic. Park nearby was almost empty, a few joggers, a mother pushing a stroller, a boy feeding pigeons, and I found a bench under a tall tree and just sat there observing life moving around me, not rushing, not chasing, just breathing. And while sitting there, I remembered that wedding day in 2010 when I walked in alone, and everyone laughed. I remembered the way their eyes followed me like I was a joke, an inconvenience, like they were expecting me to beg for a seat or a smile. And I remembered how Jasmine had looked away pretending I was a stranger. I remembered the sound of my heels against the marble floor, the sound of my own heart beating too loud in my ears, and yet I did not break, I did not run, I sat alone, and I watched and I endured, and now years later, I was no longer that girl, I was a woman who had built something strong from everything that once shattered me. I stood up from the bench and kept walking until I reached a small cafe near the corner where I used to sit and dream of a different life. I ordered a pastry and tea and sat by the window watching strangers pass by, and I wondered how many of them were also carrying stories behind their calm faces, how many had been laughed at, dismissed, rejected, and still chose to show up every day like quiet warriors. When I finished, I walked over to the nearby bookstore, a place I had always loved, and as I browsed the shelves, a little girl bumped into me and apologized, and her mother called out, "Be careful," and smiled at me, and I smiled back and thought how strange it is that kindness from strangers sometimes feels warmer than words from family. I picked up a journal with a soft green cover and bought it without thinking. I knew it was time to write again, not about pain, but about growth. I spent the rest of the day gathering things I loved: fresh flowers, a new plant, a small frame for an old photo of me as a child, and when I returned home I cleaned my space, played soft music, and lit a candle. And for the first time in years I felt completely at peace as the sky turned orange and then deep blue. I sat at my desk and opened the new journal and wrote, "This is not the story of a girl who was broken. It is the story of a woman who rebuilt herself piece by piece." I paused and stared at the sentence for a long time, then continued, "I do not need revenge or validation. I do not need them to understand me. I only need to keep becoming the version of myself that feels most true." And when I closed the journal, I felt full, not with noise or memories, but with presence. That night I slept deeply without dreams and woke up with a steady heart. The next few days were simple. I volunteered at the library, helped a local artist set up her gallery opening, attended a small poetry reading, and even agreed to mentor a student who reminded me of myself. She had bright eyes, a sharp mind, and a voice that trembled when she spoke, and I told her, "It is okay to tremble, just do not let that stop you from speaking." She smiled and said, "I want to be like you," and I said, "No, be like you, just do not shrink for anyone." We met every week after that, and each time she grew a little louder, a little braver, and I saw in her the seeds of everything I had once hoped to become. Then one evening I received an invitation in the mail. It was from Jasmine. She was organizing a small family dinner and wanted me to come. No pressure, no expectations, just presence. I stared at the envelope for a long time and finally decided I would go, not for her, not for them, but for me, because I wanted to face the last thread of fear still wrapped around my ribs. When the day came, I wore a navy blue dress with a soft neckline, simple and strong, just like the woman I had become. I walked into the restaurant, and for a second I felt that old ache rise, but I pushed it down with a breath and entered. Jasmine was already there, standing near the door, and when she saw me, she smiled, a real smile, not the forced one I had seen years ago. She hugged me lightly and said, "Thank you for coming." And I said, "Thank you for inviting me." My parents were seated at the table already, and when my mother saw me, she looked away for a moment, then stood up and hugged me tightly and whispered, "I do not know how to fix the past, but I hope we can start again." And I said, "We can try," and my father nodded at me with glassy eyes and said we were wrong, and I did not say anything, but I nodded back, and that was enough. The dinner was quiet, not filled with laughter or ease, but with effort, and that meant something at the end. Jasmine handed me a small gift, a photo album filled with childhood pictures, and at the very end a blank page and a note that said, "Maybe we can fill the rest together." I did not cry. I simply closed the book and said, "Maybe we can," and walked out into the night with the stars above me and no weight on my shoulders. Weeks passed and life began to settle into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. I woke up every day not haunted by the past, but grounded in the present. I stopped waiting for apologies to heal me and started letting peace take their place. I began writing more, filling the journal with thoughts, reflections, and moments that once might have broken me, but now only made me stronger, the girl who had once walked into her sister's wedding alone and laughed at. had become a woman who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. One afternoon, while walking through the market, I saw an old family friend, someone who had been at that wedding, someone who had laughed and whispered and stared. She looked at me now with different eyes. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe just surprise at who I had become. She said, "I almost did not recognize you," and I smiled and replied, "That tends to happen when someone grows." And she looked like she wanted to say more, but simply nodded and walked away. And I felt no bitterness, only clarity. Sometimes growth makes others uncomfortable, especially those who preferred you small. I continued mentoring the student who had become more like a little sister. Her confidence was blooming, and every time she raised her voice in a room, I felt like the world was slowly changing, even if just a little, and I held on to that hope. One evening, Jasmine texted me asking if I wanted to join her for coffee. She said she had something to share, and though a part of me was cautious, I agreed. We met at the same cafe where I used to go alone, and as she sat across from me, I saw that she was different too, not entirely, but enough. She told me she was in therapy, working through years of buried jealousy and resentment. She admitted that for a long time she saw me not as a sister, but as someone she had to outshine and impress because our parents had placed us in this unspoken competition that neither of us ever asked for. She said she had blamed me for things I never did just because it was easier than blaming the people who actually created the pain, and for the first time she did not ask for forgiveness, she just owned it. She sat with her words and let silence follow, and I respected that because real growth is not in perfect apologies, but in honest accountability. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I was not holding onto the past anymore. I said we could try to rebuild, but only if it felt real, and she agreed. She said she would not rush it, but she wanted to earn it, and that was enough for now. We parted ways with a quiet hug, and as I walked home, I realized I was finally free, not because she apologized, but because I had stopped needing her to. My parents began reaching out more slowly, hesitantly. My father would send articles or old pictures with the simple thought of you, and my mother asked about my work once in a while, and it was not warm or close, but it was a start, and I accepted it for what it was without expectation. I kept building my own life, decorating my small apartment with soft lights and warm colors. I planted herbs on my windowsill and read poetry before bed, and cooked meals for myself with care, as if I was the guest of honor every evening. I started leading a writing group at the local library, where women came to share their stories, some trembling, some loud, but all brave, and I listened to them as they unwrapped years of silence and turned it into sentences that filled the room with power, and I felt proud to create a space I once needed for myself. One day, I received a message from a girl who had seen me at that wedding years ago. She said she remembered how I walked in alone and sat with my head held high, even when people whispered, and she wanted me to know that it inspired her, that she never forgot it. And now she was going through her own family mess and was trying to find that same strength, and I stared at the message with tears in my eyes, not of pain, but of pride, because sometimes we do not realize the power of surviving out loud. I replied to her with the words I once needed someone to say to me: "You are not the problem, their behavior is, and you are allowed to choose yourself even if they never understand." I hit send and felt something settle deep within me, a peace so pure it felt almost sacred. Months passed, and my sister eventually invited me to a family celebration, a small gathering this time, no grand wedding, no performance, just dinner and stories and cautious laughter. I decided to go, dressed in soft cotton and calm energy, and when I arrived they did not stare, they just made space for me, and Jasmine saved me a seat, and my parents smiled, and it was not perfect, but it was not hostile, and for the first time I did not feel like I was surviving the room, I was simply in it, existing at myself. After dinner, Jasmine pulled me aside and showed me a photo album. She had been updating it from the one she gave me earlier, and now it included pictures of both of us as children, teens, adults, moments I had forgotten, and some I never saw. She pointed to a page with an old picture of us on bicycles and said this was the last time I remember us laughing without tension, and I said maybe we can find that again, or something better, and she said maybe, and it felt sincere, and that was a beginning too. On the walk back home, I thought of all the versions of myself that had once cried it. Silence stayed small to make others big, waited for invitations that never came. I thought of the girl in 2010, walking into that wedding alone, feeling like the punchline of a cruel joke, and I wanted to reach back through time and hold her hand and whisper, "You will survive this, and not just survive, you will thrive, you will grow into someone you admire, you will create your own joy, your own peace, your own power, and they will see it not because you force them to, but because truth always finds its light." I reached home and sat on my balcony under a sky full of stars, and I opened my journal and wrote the final lines of this chapter. I walked into that wedding alone, but I walked out of that pain stronger. I was their joke once, but now I am my own pride. I have learned that revenge is not always loud. Sometimes it is just peace and joy and silence in a life they never thought I could build. And as the wind moved gently through the leaves, I closed the journal, not because the story ended, but because a new one was ready to begin. And this time I would be the one writing it word by word, choice by choice, never again shrinking, never again waiting, never again begging for a seat at a table that was never meant for me, because now I build my own tables and sit at them fully whole. Outro. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.